Welcome back, everybody. This is lesson 3-1 on Roosevelt and Progressivism. We're going to be looking at the progressive era for the next 3 lessons and see how it transformed America or helped change America after all the problems of the Gilded Age. But let's first get into what the Gilded Age was again. The Gilded Age was that idea that society had this thin layer of wealth covering up all the problems of society. But by the late 1800s, those problems were becoming very clear to everyone. The super rich, that top 0.1%, were benefiting from the economy of the United States more than anyone else. And a group of people had done a very good job by the late 1800s of uncovering this scandal and this filth in the American economy. These people were referred to as muckrakers because they were willing to dig through all the slime and muck and filth of American industrial society to see how it really worked. And with those muckrakers doing their job, a political movement known as progressivism took hold to try to fix those problems. Now, to fix this problem, there were a lot of things that progressives needed to do. We're going to go through several of those today. The first target was the system of political patronage. This is the exchange of government jobs and contracts for political favors. So if you can organize a group of voters and convince that group of voters to support you in an election, you take the organizer and you reward them with a plum government job or government contracts going forward. This is, of course, corrupt and undemocratic and shouldn't be done, and progressives try to target that to make sure that it wouldn't happen. It still happens today, but it's not as bad as it used to be. Progressives also wanted a direct primary instead of conventions for nominations to political office. In a direct primary, the public gets to choose the people that appear on the ballot. That is, when you go to vote, you've got 2 names there. Let's say in 2016, we had Hillary Clinton and we had Donald Trump, among others, for the presidential nomination for the United States. But how did they appear on that ballot? Well, now it's through a primary system or a caucus system in some states. But in any case, people get to have a say in who these people are. Before that, they were just selected by a small group of party members in a back room, and it was kind of undemocratic. All right, other reforms. Progressives wanted 3 additional reforms. One is the initiative. The initiative is the idea that the voters themselves can propose a law. Rather than voting for representatives and having the legislature propose laws, with an initiative, a voter and a group of voters can directly propose that law, and they can skip the government. A referendum is where the voters themselves get to vote on that law. So initiative is they propose it. A referendum is that the people themselves get to vote on a law. The two kind of go hand in hand. A recall is the final one. A recall is where the voters, they're not crazy about the choice that they just made for political office. So they're going to ask to have a do-over. And they vote to basically hold a new election and to get an elected official out of office. This happens a lot on the state level, but there is no system for doing this on a federal level. We can't recall our senators, congressmen, or the president. But on a state level, we can. All right, social welfare was another big topic of the progressive movement. Progressive leaders wanted to make sure that social problems in society was functioning better and people were happier. A leader in this was a woman by the name of Jane Addams. She's going to come up a few times over the next couple days. Jane Addams was the founder of the Hull House in Chicago, and the purpose of the Hull House was to help unemployed women in particular, largely immigrants, but not exclusively, and to help promote the rights of women in the workforce, to make sure that women were not being mistreated at work. There was also a rising prohibition movement, and the prohibition movement will actually be successful. Prohibition comes from the word prohibit. So what were they trying to prohibit? They were trying to prohibit alcohol. Many progressives, believed that alcohol was a cause of laziness and violence and should be eliminated from American society. Economic reform was, of course, the big one. The problems of American society were largely economic, and so economic issues were tackled by the progressives. By 1890, we'd already had trusts like Standard Oil. Trust is a big collection of companies that work together. Standard Oil was one of those. And they controlled much of the economy. If you wanted oil in the United States, you had to go through Standard Oil, which means they control the prices and distribution of oil, who gets it and how much it costs. In 1890, Congress outlawed trusts in the Sherman Antitrust Act. Trusts became illegal in 1890, but there was a problem because the law never defined the word trust. So there was some lack of clarity on what was a trust and what was not a trust. So this Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 was not all that successful early on. Now, President Roosevelt is our first progressive president, and there will be 3 progressive presidents that we learn about over these 3 lessons. Now, the important thing to know about Roosevelt is that he's an accidental president. He was never supposed to be president. He was a popular character. He was a hero in the Spanish-American War, and then he became a popular governor of New York. But the Republican Party kind of wanted to sideline Roosevelt. And a great way to do that was to make him vice president of the United States, because a vice president has no actual political power in the United States. So President McKinley invited Roosevelt to be vice president. Roosevelt accepted that. And as vice president, Roosevelt had virtually no power. Well, that is, right up until this guy right here decided to shoot McKinley because he didn't like McKinley. He was hoping for a little political patronage. He wanted a job with McKinley, and McKinley said no and died for it. And McKinley was assassinated pretty early into his term. So Roosevelt gets almost a full term as president under McKinley's election. Roosevelt was that first progressive president. He liked to talk to Americans about what he called the square deal. The square deal is to make sure that everybody is treated fairly. He didn't want to approach this as a purely pro-worker president, nor a pro-business president. He wanted to make sure that both workers and businesses were always treated fairly. To do this, he did use the Sherman Antitrust Act to go after the big, really bad trusts like Standard Oil, but tried to treat other businesses, and Standard Oil, tried to treat all businesses fairly. Voters really appreciated this, really appreciated that Roosevelt was going after the worst of the worst and tackling the bad guys. And they supported this effort by re-electing him by a very clear margin. And once he was reelected, and reelected by this huge margin, congressmen picked up on the hint. And they said, hey, if we want to get reelected as well, we should support Roosevelt's programs. We should do what we can to help move progressivism forward. And Congress itself at that point became a progressive organization. In this, they passed a lot of laws, including the Meat Inspection Act. Before this, nobody really looked to see that the meat that we were eating was healthy. There was some pretty nasty stuff going on. And we also have the Pure Food and Drug Act. As progressive as Roosevelt was on a number of issues, it's important to note that Roosevelt was not very progressive when it came to civil rights. He held personal beliefs that were pro-civil rights. He believed that discrimination was morally wrong, but he never wanted to take the political risk for fighting for civil rights. He saw what had happened to the Reconstruction presidents and how civil rights issues had completely bogged down their presidencies, and he didn't want to take that risk. He wanted to do other things. So he never took the political risk, never fought for civil rights. One thing he did fight for is conservation. Roosevelt's longest lasting impact on American society is his love of conservation of nature. While president, he doubled the number of national parks in the United States and created our first wildlife refuges. And he did this, as he said, for the enjoyment of our children and our children's children. The idea being that these national treasures would exist forever and never be taken away, despite the development of the rest of society. Now, he created so many that Congress even eventually got a little hesitant here, and they're like, we've created a few too many of these national parks. But Roosevelt was able to find a loophole. He used something that existed called the Antiquities Act. The Antiquities Act did not require congressional approval in order for Roosevelt to create national monuments. And national monuments was never really defined well within that law. So it might have been that they were looking at things like the Washington Monument in Washington D.C. as that type of monument. But Roosevelt simply said, "No, you see that mountain over there? That mountain is a national monument." And nobody could really legally argue that he didn't have that power. So with the Antiquities Act, he was able to create a number of other national monuments, including Grand Canyon, Petrified Forest, and several others. So this was President Roosevelt as a progressive president. I hope you learned a thing or two today, and I'll see you next time. Farewell.